You're already giving off a vibe. The question is, do you know what it's saying? In today's conversation about power, I'm talking to Dr. Jason Gandio, who's probably the only person on earth with a PhD in vibes. He spent over 30 years studying them. And today we're talking about vibes, about science, and about how vibes help us. Right. Another conversation about power. And today I'm talking to Jason Gandio, who's going to be talking to us about vibes. And we've just been talking about the fact that I'm not entirely sure when this conversation is going to go. And that's exactly my kind of conversation. You know, it's exploring this, finding out what's going to happen. But what I do know is that Jason is going to be able to, you're going to be able to talk about vibes from lots of different angles. So I'm really looking forward to this and exploring this with him. So Jason, welcome. Thank you for being here. And could you give us a bit of introduction? Who are you? Where do you live? What do you do?
And then sure. Well, first, obviously, thank you for having me on the show, Lynn. I appreciate it. So I'm looking forward to this conversation about vibes and power. So my name is Jason Gandio. I'm a college professor at Temple University, which is in Philadelphia in the United States of America. I live just outside of Philadelphia. I was in Philly for a long time, but we bought a house in South Jersey about 7 years ago. Right? At Temple University, my expertise is the theory and practice of social justice with a focus on activism and social movements. So I study how human beings create positive social change. I've been doing that for decades now. However, outside of Temple, my other expertise is the study of vibes. Vibes in the plural, vibe in the singular, etc. Right? And I've been studying vibes on and off for about 30 years, since my late teens, going into graduate school and then becoming a college professor, becoming a scholar and academic, and so on. Right? The first question people usually ask me is like, well, what do you mean by the word vibe? All right. So my basic definition is a vibe is the exchange of energy between you and other people. So again, the exchange of energy between you and other people. But of course, the first question becomes, what is the nature of this energy? So for instance, is this energy a physical phenomenon or a metaphysical phenomenon? Is it a material phenomenon or is it an immaterial phenomenon? Is it a scientific phenomenon or is it a spiritual phenomenon, or perhaps all these things at the same time, depending on how you look at it, how you experience it, how you want to talk about it, etc. And to pause there just for a moment, most people talk about vibes. Most people refer to vibes on a regular basis. So as an example of that, I would invite your listeners to take note over the next week or so about how often they use the word vibe, or they hear someone else using the word vibe, or some variation. So vibe, vibrations, energy, frequency, and so on, right? And I almost guarantee that you'll be shocked about how often you come across the word vibe. But for myself, as a scholar, as an academic, and first and foremost as an intellectual, my question is, well, what are we talking about when we say the word vibe? What do we mean? How do we explain it? How do we define it? And that basic question of like, what is this thing that we're talking about has really driven my own interest in vibes, really my entire life. And so that's a brief introduction to who I am and what I study and what I do.
Right. So when I think of the word vibe, I think sort of hippies. And then, that was when people started talking about vibes. But I'm guessing that people have been talking about this in different ways for a lot longer.
Yes, right. So you are correct, right, in terms of the word vibe is often associated with hippie culture coming out of the 1960s and then moving forward. We still have hippies today, right? And I have plenty of hippie friends and I hang out in hippie scenes. But like you suggest, the word is much more extensive and much older than just 1960s onward, right? So from my own research, most, if not all, societies and cultures around the world have some version of this form. So I know in the United States we say vibe, in Canada they say vibe, in Britain, in Ireland, there are variations about this of this word in Portugal, Spain, Germany, so on and so on and so on. All right. And then in terms of older traditions, we can point to, let's say, ancient Chinese philosophies or ancient Japanese philosophies or philosophies and practices and traditions coming from India. And there's all some version of energy, right? Often understood as the vital life force, right? Which would be the primordial vibration and which everything from there emerges from that, right? And then different traditions and different societies have kind of their own history of this understanding of energy and vital life force. Now, to pause there for a moment, not everyone that nowadays who uses the word vibe is talking about a vital life force, but it's part of the conversation, right? So when we talk about a vibe, what do we mean, right? Why is vibe talk and vibe terminology so common? And one of the questions I'm interested in is, well, is there some kind of subconscious or unconscious driver that compels us to talk about vibes, even when we're not consciously thinking about vital life force and vital vibrations?
Yeah, because even just listening to you explaining this, I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, we've got what's going on inside us, we've got our reactions to other people and what it does to how we feel. Some people you like to be around and they have a good vibe, and then there are people that they're giving you bad vibes, and we know how to we understand what it means.
Right.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. So now I'm thinking, yeah, what is it? Yeah. So thank you for
That's the question. That's the question I'm pursuing my entire life.
yeah. So when did you first start becoming interested in vibes? I mean, you weren't hanging out in the 60s, with a joint and talking about vibes, man, were you? So when did this start for you?
Well, I grew up in a household where the word vibe was commonly used, and we all knew what it meant. No one had to explain to you. Side note to that, though, my father was a hippie back in the 60s. And
Right.
then my aunt, his sister, who I was very close with, she helped raise me, was also a major hippie. So that there's no doubt that had an influence on my life. There's no doubt about that, right? But then in my late teens, early 20s, I was part of lots of underground scenes, subcultures. So the early New York City rave scene, I was part of various roving fans, like in terms of the Grateful Dead, different kind of bands that have a fan base that would talk about vibes, right? So they would use the word vibe to describe the band, the DJ, the dance floor, the concert, one's personal feeling, all these kinds of things. And really, at the age of 19 or 20, I started to realize that we're all talking about vibes, but no one's defining it. So at a very early age, I took up an intellectual interest in this thing we call the vibe. Then I wrote my first paper on the vibe in a college class on nonverbal communication. Then I went to graduate school and I used my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation to create my own philosophy of the vibe referred to as bodily emanation. In other words, the body emanates or radiates an
Yeah.
actual tangible feeling that other bodies respond to and experience.
Okay. So, another way that people might be describing that is auras and things like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all
Yeah.
part of the same conversation. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
So, okay. So you're a doctor of vibes. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. Yeah. So, I guess you just based on curiosity, you decided, hey, I want to find out what this is all about. And I mean, that's one of those things about studying, isn't it? You get a chance to really jump into something. We were just talking about that before
Yeah.
we started recording that, I studied German, and one of my central questions when I was studying was, German history in the 30s. How was that possible? So
Right.
4 years thinking about that in great detail, reading a lot of books, trying to find out. So, these things, I think, those intellectual curiosities, they're telling us also something about what we think is important in life, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. 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 And then just to back up for a second, so my intellectual interest about vibes was really based on the experience of vibes, though, right? So whether I was going to a rave or some kind of underground club or some concerts and having the experience of like ecstasy, like the ecstatic experience, like the classic ecstatic experience, right?
Right.
Which then pulls you kind of out of your normal everyday mindsets and makes you aware of other things that are happening in the world, right? And so in having those ecstatic experiences, like, oh, what is that? Like that's earth shattering. That moves you in a certain kind of way. And it was the experience first that then led me to understand, like, what did I just experience? How are we talking about this? And what does it all mean? All right. And then from there, I've been obsessed with the same kinds of questions for really almost 30 years now. So
Yeah, well, there's a lot of value in good questions, right?
sure, of course, yeah.
When we think we have all the answers, I think sometimes that's when all the problems start. So are you talking about, when you're talking about your experience of vibes, are you talking about, an individual experience, or are you also talking about being with a group of people and being in a sort of joint experience?
Well, it would be all of the above. When I was younger, it was really more about the collective experience, right? Of the dance floor, of a concert, of a sporting event, whatever the case may be. But as you were saying earlier, vibes are happening all the time, right? Whether I am at a musical concert with 20,000 people or if I'm walking through the woods by myself, right? There's always some kind of vibe, some kind of bodily emanation that you can tap into and experience. And I think of vibes as an ongoing dialogue between bodies. Right? My body, your body, the body of the listeners and the viewers, the bodies that exist at a grocery store or on the beach in the summer or whatever the case may be, right? And so then the question becomes, how do we learn to participate in that ongoing vibrational dialogue? And so then what steps can we take to accentuate that, to highlight that, and to elevate that experience to a conscious way of life?
Right. So there's been occasions where I have, been around somebody that I'd never met. And I remember one woman in particular, she gave off such a bad vibe that I thought, whoa, I don't want anything to do with you. It
Yeah.
was such a strong, whatever it was,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that I thought, no, I'm going to keep away from you because you are trouble.
Yeah,
You
100%,
are
sure.
trouble. Yeah. So I think we all have those experiences, don't we? The
Yes.
same as when you meet somebody and you think, oh, I want to get to know you. That's more of a sort of open, positive kind of a vibe. And then there are also people that you think, well, I've got to protect myself from this
Sure.
person. Yeah. So what do you think is going on then? What from all your research, what do you think is happening?
Well, based on kind of the paradigm or philosophy that I have created, and worked out over the years, all right, I would say that every human body is perpetually giving off a vibe. In other words, it's a constant, like it's just always there, right? And then some people have stronger vibes than others. Some people have weaker vibes than others. And then one's core personality is also a vibe, right? And it's
Yeah.
one thing to encounter someone that's in a bad mood in that moment, and they're giving off a bad and awkward vibe. But it's another thing to encounter someone where their core vibe, their core personality is negative, is bad, is not jiving with my vibe, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So there are different ways to distinguish between good vibes and bad vibes in different layers and levels. And so I think when we encounter somewhere like something's not right here, that's usually something's going on with that person's vibe in terms of their core vibe, not just a moment in their life, right? Now I don't want to say that about everyone, right? But generally speaking, I think that's what's happening there. And I would say that we can learn to better tune ourselves to this vibrational dialogue, and then it can become a form of knowledge, a form of insight, or to segue into your topic here, a form of power, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so learning to cultivate that, though, I think is an important life skill that can be helpful in lots of situations.
Yeah. So tell me again, you say so people can have strong vibes and weak vibes. So can you tell me a bit more about that? Because that is intriguing to me. I've recognized it. I mean, some people you can't help but react to in some way, and some people it's like you don't notice them. But what do you think that is? Because we also
Um,
talk about strong personalities and weak personalities, and
sure.
yeah, but
There's a correlation between those kinds
yeah,
of terms, right? So, as an example, think of a speaker on stage who has amazing charisma and can hold the entire audience spellbound.
yeah,
Meanwhile, other speakers have no stage presence whatsoever. Right? And so that would be an example of someone having a very strong vibe and someone having a very weak vibe. Now, if a listener is hearing this and saying, like, well, I want to increase my vibe strength, or whatever terminology you want to use, that can be done. In other words, there's always the ability to change your vibe, to increase your vibe, to dial it up, to dial it down, so on and so on and so on. It's basically a skill set that you can learn to achieve in your daily life. Right? And so that's what I mean by a stronger vibe or a weaker vibe. But then also, and we can talk about this in other kinds of ways as well. So I think there's more of a vibe and a stronger vibe as more people gather, right? Which explains the difference between being alone by yourself and
yeah,
being in a small group a large group, a large crowd, so on and so on and so on. And there's also a correlation between the number of bodies and the proximity of those bodies. So as bodies become closer and closer, like in terms of physical distance, there's a stronger vibe there, as opposed to a weaker vibe where I'm here in the United States, you're over the Netherlands. I mean, that's a lot of distance between us, right? Having said all of that, there's always a vibe happening, and I pictured it in terms of a global vibe where each body gives off a vibe, and there are bodies all across the planet. Therefore, there must be a global vibe, right? And then that global vibe, though, can also be used as an existential guide for your life. In other words, if you can attune yourself to this global vibe, you can use that vibe then to push you and pull you to certain people, away from certain people, into certain experiences and events, away from certain experiences and events, and so on.
So it's really about recognizing what's happening inside you. You need that skill, don't you, to be able to recognize
Yes.
what's happening inside you. I mean, for me, one of the things is literally, do I move towards somebody? Do I move away from somebody? That is it can be a tiny movement, but if I'm aware of that, then I know what my body's trying to tell me about that person. And then the kind of people you want to move towards, being aware of that, and then recognizing them and moving towards more of them.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I really think, in the West, this is a skill that we have. I don't know what's happened with us, but we've unlearned this. Been told it's not a good idea. It's not intellectual. It's not up here, so it has no value. I remember being in Morocco the first time I was there with my ex-husband, and he was waiting to get some money out of a cash dispenser, and he just turned around. He was facing the cash dispenser, and at a certain point, he just turned around and he yelled at somebody. I thought, what's that? And then this guy just disappeared. And he
Oh,
said,
wow.
I felt he was up to no good. And this
Mhm.
was somebody behind his back at
Yeah,
a
yeah.
distance of, I don't know, a couple of meters.
Mhm.
He didn't need to see him to be able to feel that this guy was up to no good.
Sure. Yeah.
I thought, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can do this. We don't even need to be able to see somebody. We can just
Right.
feel and
Yeah.
react to it in that kind of a way. Yeah. Yeah.
Just pause there for a moment, though. A skilled con artist or a skilled professional liar will learn how to use their vibe to their advantage. So it cuts both ways, right? So, if you think of it like an actual professional con artist, they've trained their vibe to match their nonverbal communication, to match what they're saying, right? To match their self-presentation, so they can lie to you and manipulate you, right? And that's where it becomes almost like a form of, martial arts. Like both sides need to develop their skill set relative to vibes to see
Yeah.
who's going to win that battle of intuition, of knowing, of insight, etc.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe why we, without thinking it through, can be quite nervous around people who are very charismatic, because we're aware that people can, you know, present like that when really they're trying to get something else.
Sure, 100%. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Again, quick example. I was at an event, and it was a political event. A national politician in the Netherlands came in. Everybody stopped moving and focused on him. I thought, how did you do that? It wasn't that he was saying, hi, I'm here, or anything like that. It was just the natural reaction of everybody in the room. They turned around and paid attention, thinking, wow, this is how strong this stuff can be, isn't it?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Does that mean he's a good person? No, not necessarily.
Right. That's a very good point. Right. Yes.
Yeah.
A strong vibe and being very charismatic does not necessarily translate into being a good human being. They're not the same kind of thing, right? Plenty of dictators throughout history have been horrible human beings and had very strong vibes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and without going into politics too much. It's work. Right. Yeah. So, okay, Jason, having sort of like dug into the idea of vibes and what they are and how they work. So if I say the word power, what associations do you have with it being a doctor of vibes?
Sure. It's a great question. It's almost overwhelming because in my mind, there's no aspect of power that is not in some way related to vibes. Right? And so I guess the question is, how might these two things relate, like vibes and power? Right? And I would say, well, you could think of using your vibe as a form of power empowerment, like self empowerment, right? So how might you develop your vibe skill set, your vibe knowledge, your vibe intelligence as a way to boost your self confidence, as a way to increase your charisma, as a way to develop a kind of knowledge about other people and about yourself, about situations, kind of what we've been talking about. And I think all of that is different. It relates to forms of power. Right. Then you can also use your vibe in a form of negative power in terms of dominating and controlling people. Right. So the vibe you give off can intimidate people. If I think about a street fight between two individuals, in the first few seconds before the fight even happens, a fight can either be won or lost simply about the vibe you give off. Someone's giving off an intense vibe, someone gets intimidated, now it doesn't even happen, right? So all of these things relate to vibes and power. I mean, they're I think they go hand in hand.
Yeah, you're making me think of a lot of examples when you're speaking, reminding me of situations. A long time ago, I did karate, and I remember being out for the evening with a friend, also not a very, also a vertically challenged woman, and but she'd also done karate, and there were a group of guys who were following us and being a pain, and we looked at each other and we said, "Hey." We both sort of acknowledged at that moment, oh, we've done karate, and then we just walked and they left us.
Oh yeah,
And that's sometimes how it works. I was glad they didn't follow us, to be honest, but just having
of
that
course, yeah. Mhm.
that vibe at that moment was, did the trick.
Sure.
So when do you feel most powerful?
Oh, good question. It's kind of a scary question. I don't know what's going to come up. I don't know. Like that's when do I feel most powerful? I very much enjoy the public speaking experience. And I've been obviously teaching for, at this point, almost 30 years since I first walked into the classroom as a teacher at the age of 22. I went to graduate school and then I was a teaching assistant, but we had full reign. It was our class. And so technically I was the age 22. And, and so I'm used to being in front of people that way. And I've developed the ability to use my vibe in the right kind of way at the right time to have a certain kind of influence and impact on the audience. I don't mean just students, but any audience. And I like the public speaking experience because you know in the moment if you're doing it well or not well. So, for instance, with the writing process, if after writing for a long time, and I've written a lot in my life, you kind of know when you have a good paragraph or a good line, something like that. But it's often waiting on response from a reader where you know if you got it right or not. When you're speaking in public or on a stage platform, at least I know in the moment if I'm hitting it in the right way or not. And in that sense, I feel very much empowered in that moment to be able to orchestrate and facilitate that experience for the audience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because sometimes when you write something, somebody can come back to you a year later or several years later and say what you wrote then had a real big impact, but you're
Right.
not aware of that when you're writing it. You might write and think, hey, this is pretty good, but you don't know. No, exactly. That's much more immediate feedback then. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So what do you enjoy about power?
Oof. Another scary question. Wow, I'm afraid what what I might say. What do I enjoy about power? I enjoy the possibility of having a positive impact on the world. Right? Using my power, whether that be a vibe or something else, in a way that evokes and facilitates better relations amongst human beings, that evokes and facilitates different thoughts and ideas about what kind of world we might create for ourselves. That's based on the presumption that everything that exists, we create it as human beings. In other words, we create our own social realities. And if this is what we created, we can recreate the world in a different kind of way that is far beyond anything that's happening right now. Right? And I think that kind of power is the power that I'm most interested in. And I think that kind of power literally has the ability to change the world for the better.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, what I'm doing with that question is trying to change, our ideas about power are quite often colored by dominance, negative.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but there are so many things we can do with it if we're aware of it, if we know how to use it. So yeah, yeah. So new possibilities we couldn't think of yet.
You're right. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. So what do you do if you want to feel more powerful? Is there somewhere you go, or is there some practice you have, or
It's a good question, and I want to be self-reflective here in terms of my identity markers and being a white, straight, cis, male, middle class, etc., especially living in the United States, especially nowadays. And so I'm viewed with an abundance of privileges that not everyone has access to, right? So I want to frame it that way first, right? But in terms of what I enjoy most about power, again, is having uh, a positive impact on people, right? Using my privilege and power to help other people, help other individuals, right? To shape the world in a positive way. And if I could use my power in any way, shape, or form, I would do it to invite people to, again, rethink the nature of our current world and to reimagine a different kind of world where everyone is liberated. And I mean full liberation, like total liberation, both internally, externally, psychologically, emotionally, socially, politically, and so on.
okay. I don't normally do that at this do this at this stage of the interview, but I am going to ask you, what do you think the world would be like if we were all fully liberated?
Well, it's hard to imagine that without some type of spiritual connotation. And when I say that, I don't mean in terms of organized religion or anything like that, right? And I don't even necessarily mean in terms of a higher power or God or anything like that, but in terms of spiritual in the highest sense possible, where you kind of close your eyes and you operate on, again, for lack of better words, faith, and we engage each other from that kind of core humanity as opposed to pre-established boxes, pre-established notions about how we should live or what we should do, and instead collectively we are facilitating a different kind of human species on this planet.
Right. So not working from preconceived ideas, but choosing for yourself and allowing other people to choose for themselves as
Right.
well. Yeah.
Right. And just to clarify that as a more, because I know this is very abstract, right? But think of jazz musicians and
Mhm.
where they play improvisational music with each other, and each person is literally in the moment, right, experiencing what the other person is experiencing, and they're playing off of each other. Now take that kind of example and apply it to all of humanity, and the question then becomes, is it possible for humanity to exist as a jazz improvisational moment, right? And that changes, though, the sense of ethics, the sense of values, the sense of sisterhood and brotherhood, the sense of connection, all those kinds of things. It changes how we exist as a species.
Yeah, so in terms of spirituality, you're sort of talking about, the experience of oneness, aren't you? That
Yes,
everything is all connected and yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's a beautiful thing to, I don't know if you play music yourself.
I do not. No, I wish I did, but I do not play music. No.
Yeah, but I can remember being in an orchestra when I was a
Yep.
teenager and experiencing that and the flow that
Yep.
came from everybody being involved, working with their hearts and minds and bodies to create this piece of music. You could feel it in the air. It
Yep.
was magical, beautiful.
And
Yeah.
just again, pause there. I want to highlight that. So there's a famous book about flow by the famous psychologist. I forget his name, and the
the,
notion
the,
of
the Czech guy whose name you can't
yeah,
pronounce.
yeah. That's why I'm bypassing on the name. I cannot pronounce the name,
Yeah.
so I apologize. I cannot pronounce it. But
Yeah.
then also moments of synchronicity, etc. And we think of these things as very heightened moments that only happen to certain people at certain times. But as the research shows, most human beings have some experience of that at some point in their life, right? It could be playing music, it could be playing sports, it could be doing dance, it could be gardening in your backyard, going for a hike in the woods. But we have these small moments in our life where we experience this flow, this synchronicity, and also this vibe. And then the question becomes, how can we elevate that experience to a collective phenomenon and then have that sit at the center of our lives?
That is a great question. So, and so, Jason, what would you say to business owners who wouldn't describe themselves as powerful or they shy away from power? What would you encourage them to do?
One, I would ask them to rethink their understanding of power. So, as you suggested before, power is not just in the negative, it can also be in the positive. It's not just about control over people or dominating people. It's also about being self-empowered, elevating the power of other people, etc. Right? Then from there, though, I would say I would invite them to be their genuine, authentic selves, right? In terms of their business practices, their business visions, etc. And I say that because most of us are attracted to people who are authentic. Someone who is genuinely authentic gives off a certain kind of vibe, a certain kind of energy. We feel that, we can experience that, and then we want to emulate that. Like we that's why it's attractive, right? And if you can do that as a business owner, I think that itself is a form of self-empowerment that can drive your business forward.
Yeah, and the information I'm getting about that is that that is becoming increasingly a thing, especially with, with younger consumers, millennials,
Yeah.
Gen Z, what have you. It's becoming much more important that we're as authentic as we possibly can be. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there any last thing you'd like us to know?
So when we think about vibes, and although we all have a core vibe that we emanate all the time, we also want to think about vibes in terms of habits and practices. And so if you want to develop your vibe skill set, so to speak, right, then you have to practice that. It's like meditation or mindfulness. It doesn't happen on its own, but rather you make it into a daily habit. And then over time, it becomes easier for you and you can elevate your vibe in a different kind of way, right? Not just something that's passive and happens on its own, but now you have the power to control your vibe and to emanate the vibe that you so choose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks for being here, Jason. I really appreciate it. I've got lots of new ideas. You've inspired me to think about things that I haven't thought about for a while or haven't thought about in quite the way that you've been describing them. So thank you for coming and sharing all your knowledge with us today and your insights. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Hey, if you enjoyed today's episode, why not try out this episode or this one instead and find out more about how power can work for you and your business?